Blood spilled across Margaret Calloway's pristine white wedding gown as she slapped Gregory Townsend hard across his smug face. The gathered townsfolk of Silverton, Colorado gasped in collective shock as the bride's palm connected with her would-be husband's cheek on that crisp autumn morning of 1879. "You worthless coward," Margaret hissed, her voice carrying across the stunned church. "You promised to love me forever, to be a father to my son. Now you tell me at the altar that you can't do it." Gregory straightened his tie, his eyes darting nervously across the packed pews. "I tried, Maggie, God knows I tried, but I can't raise another man's bastard. The whole town knows what you are." 3-year-old Thomas peered out from behind his grandmother's skirts, confused by the commotion, his innocent blue eyes wide with curiosity. Margaret felt her heart breaking for her child, the boy who deserved a father, the boy whose real father had abandoned them both when he discovered she was with child. "Get out," she whispered, then repeated with growing volume, "Get out." The church erupted in whispers as Gregory turned on his heel and walked down the aisle, leaving his bride alone before the altar. Margaret stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her carefully pinned auburn hair coming loose around her shoulders. From the back of the church, Ethan Fairfield watched the scene unfold with a tightness in his chest. The 30-year-old cowboy had been in town less than a week, taking odd jobs at local ranches while passing through on his way to California. He'd come to the wedding only because the bunkhouse foreman had insisted all the hands attend to show respect to the town's most prominent businessman. Now he stood witness to this woman's public humiliation. As the congregation began dispersing in uncomfortable clusters, Ethan noticed how they avoided the abandoned bride's gaze, how they whispered behind gloved hands. He watched as Margaret knelt beside her son, attempting to compose herself while the boy reached up to wipe her tears. Something stirred in Ethan's heart, something he hadn't felt in years. Before he could stop himself, he was moving forward, his worn boots echoing against the wooden floor of the emptying church. "Madam," he said, removing his hat as he approached. "I don't mean to intrude on your private affairs, but I wanted to offer my assistance." Margaret looked up, her tear-stained face transforming into a mask of wariness. "I don't need charity, sir." "Not offering charity," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "Just thought you might need a friendly face right now. Seems like those are in short supply." The little boy stepped forward, studying Ethan with serious eyes. "Are you a real cowboy?" he asked with childlike directness. Despite everything, Ethan felt the corner of his mouth lift. "Yes, sir, I am." "Thomas," Margaret chided gently, "don't bother the gentleman." Ethan crouched down to the boy's level. "It's no bother, madam, and yes, young man, I'm about as real a cowboy as they come." "Do you have a horse?" Thomas asked, his earlier distress forgotten in the way only a child could manage. "I do. Name's Domino, black with white spots. Can I see him sometime?" "Thomas," Margaret's voice was sharper now, "we need to go home." Ethan rose to his full height. "The offer stands, madam, if you need anything at all." Margaret gathered her son's small hand in hers, lifting her chin with wounded dignity. "Thank you, Mr. Fairfield, Ethan Fairfield. Thank you, Mr. Fairfield, but we will manage just fine." She turned to leave, the train of her wedding dress dragging behind her. "I'll be the father he never wanted to be," Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. Margaret froze, turning slowly. "What did you say?" Ethan hadn't realized he'd spoken aloud. He cleared his throat. "I said I'd be willing to be the father that coward never wanted to be." The words surprised him as much as they clearly surprised her. He hadn't planned this, hadn't even considered it until this moment, but something about this woman and her boy had awakened a protective instinct he'd thought long dormant. "You don't even know us," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know enough," Ethan replied. "I know that boy deserves better than what just happened here today, and I know that sometimes life gives us chances we didn't expect." Margaret studied him with wary eyes. "Why would you do such a thing? What could you possibly gain?" "Madam, I've been drifting for years. Maybe it's time I stopped. Maybe there's a reason I was in this church today." "You're suggesting marriage to a woman you've just met with a child?" Ethan nodded. "I am." It wouldn't have to be, he glanced at Thomas and chose his words carefully, a conventional arrangement, at least not right away, but it would give you protection, give the boy a name. And I'm handy with tools, good with horses. I can provide. Margaret's grandmother approached, her weathered face tight with concern. Margaret, we should go. People are talking. Let them talk, Margaret replied, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. This man has just proposed to me. The older woman looked Ethan up and down with suspicion. And who might you be? Ethan Fairfield, madam. I work at the Lazy S Ranch, at least for the moment. A drifter, the grandmother said dismissively. A man with his own code, Ethan countered. And I meant what I said. Margaret looked down at her son, who was watching the exchange with curious eyes. Thomas needs stability, not another man who might leave. I give you my word, I won't leave, Ethan said firmly. I know words don't mean much right now, but I'll prove it with actions if you'll give me the chance. The church was nearly empty now, only the pastor lingering near the altar, pretending not to listen to their conversation. Margaret looked around at the abandoned flower arrangements, the scattered rice that had been prepared for a celebration that would never happen. I can't make this decision now, she said finally. Not here, of course, Ethan nodded. I'm staying at the bunkhouse at the Lazy S. I'll be there when you're ready to talk. Thomas tugged at his mother's dress. Mama, I'm hungry. Margaret smiled sadly at her son. Yes, darling. We'll go home now. She looked back at Ethan. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Fairfield. It's rare in this town. Not kindness, madam, just doing what's right. As Margaret left the church, her wedding dress trailing behind her and her son's hand firmly in hers, Ethan wondered what madness had possessed him to make such an offer. He had no business proposing to anyone, least of all a woman with a child and a complicated past. Yet something about her courage in the face of humiliation had touched him deeply. He replaced his hat and stepped out into the autumn sunlight, determination settling over him like a familiar coat. He'd meant every word he'd said. If she gave him the chance, he would be the father that coward never wanted to be. And perhaps, in time, he might be something more to her as well. 3 days passed without word from Margaret. Ethan kept busy at the Lazy S, mending fences and breaking horses, trying not to think about the woman and child who had unexpectedly captured his imagination. The ranch hands ribbed him about his impromptu proposal, news of which had spread through town like wildfire. You always were a sucker for strays, Fairfield, Hank Jensen, one of the older cowboys, remarked as they sat around the bunkhouse after supper. She's not a stray, Ethan replied, whittling at a piece of wood that was slowly taking the shape of a small horse. She's a lady who got a raw deal. And the boy, you ready to be a father to another man's kid, Ethan's knife stilled. A child's a child, not his fault how he came into this world. Noble talk from a man who spent his life avoiding responsibility, Hank chuckled. People change, Ethan said simply. The bunkhouse door opened, and the ranch foreman stuck his head in. Fairfield, there's someone here to see you. Ethan stood up so quickly he almost knocked over his chair. He tucked the half-finished carving into his pocket and made his way outside, his heart hammering uncomfortably against his ribs. Margaret Calloway stood in the yard, dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly. There was no sign of her son. Mrs. Calloway, Ethan greeted her, suddenly aware of his work-stained clothes and unshaven face. Miss, she corrected gently. I never did marry Mr. Fairfield. Thomas was born out of wedlock. Ethan nodded. Would you like to walk a bit? Might be more private. They fell into step alongside the corral where several horses dozed in the fading light. For a while neither spoke, the only sound the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. I've been thinking about your proposal, Margaret finally said. It was impulsive and reckless. Yes, madam, Ethan agreed. It was, and yet, she continued, I find myself considering it anyway. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Why did you really make such an offer, Mr. Fairfield? The truth, if you please. Ethan removed his hat, turning it in his hands as he considered his answer. Partly because I admired your courage in that church, partly because I saw how that boy looked at you, and I know what it's like to grow up without a father. He paused. And maybe partly because I've been running for so long, I'm tired of having nowhere to call home. So I'd be providing you with a home as much as you'd be providing me with protection, Margaret observed. I suppose that's one way of looking at it. My grandmother thinks you're after my property. I own a small ranch just outside of town left to me by my father. Ethan's eyebrows rose. I didn't know that. It's not much 100 acres, a modest house, a few cattle, but it's mine free and clear. I'm not interested in your property, Miss Calloway. I've never been one for putting down roots, but I made you an offer, and I intend to honor it whether there's property involved or not. Margaret studied his face carefully. Thomas has taken a liking to you just from that brief meeting. He's been asking when he can see the spotted horse. Ethan smiled. Domino would be pleased to make his acquaintance any time. If I were to consider your proposal, I would need to know more about you, where you come from, what you've done. I can't bring just anyone into my son's life. That's fair, Ethan nodded. Though I should warn you, my story isn't particularly exciting. Born in Missouri, raised mostly by my mother after my father took off when I was 4, worked ranches across 5 territories. Never been in serious trouble with the law, never married? No, madam. Why not? Ethan shrugged. Never stayed in one place long enough, I suppose. And yet you're proposing to put down roots now, Margaret said skeptically. Like I said, maybe it's time. He looked her directly in the eyes. I meant what I said in that church, Miss Calloway. I'd be good to your boy and respectful to you. Margaret took a deep breath. I need time to think, Mr. Fairfield. This isn't a decision to be made lightly, of course. Would you be willing to come to Sunday dinner tomorrow, meet my grandmother properly, spend some time with Thomas? Ethan felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. I'd be honored. 2 o'clock, the house with the red roof at the end of Maple Street. I'll be there. Margaret nodded, then hesitated. Mr. Fairfield, I should be clear, I'm not looking for romance. My heart has been broken enough for one lifetime. If I accept your proposal, it would be a practical arrangement. Ethan replaced his hat. Understood, I'm not exactly the romantic type myself. Margaret's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. Then I'll see you tomorrow at 2. As she walked away, Ethan felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. He'd been sincere in his offer to provide for her and the boy, but he hadn't expected her to actually consider it. Now that she was, he found himself hoping she'd say yes for reasons that went beyond mere practicality. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching winter. Ethan spent more time than usual on his appearance, shaving carefully and donning his one good shirt, a blue cotton affair that had seen better days but was at least clean. He polished his boots and trimmed his dark hair as best he could. At 1:45, he approached the modest house at the end of Maple Street, a small carved wooden horse in his pocket for Thomas, and a bunch of wildflowers he'd gathered on the ride over for Margaret. The house was well kept, with a small garden out front and lace curtains in the windows. It spoke of feminine care despite limited means. Ethan tied Domino to the hitching post, took a deep breath, and knocked on the front door. It was Thomas who answered, his small face lighting up with recognition. "The cowboy," he exclaimed. "Hello, young man," Ethan smiled, crouching down to the boy's level. "I brought you something." He pulled out the wooden horse and offered it to the child. Thomas took it with wide eyes. "It looks like your horse." "That's right, that's Domino. Can I see the real Domino?" "If your mother says it's all right, perhaps after dinner." Margaret appeared behind her son, wiping her hands on an apron. "Mr. Fairfield, you're punctual." "Yes, madam." He straightened and held out the wildflowers. "These are for you, nothing fancy, I'm afraid." Margaret seemed surprised by the gesture. "Thank you, they're lovely." She took the flowers, her fingers brushing his momentarily. "Please come in, grandmother is in the parlor." The interior of the house was modest but comfortable, with simple furnishings and a few cherished items that spoke of better times: a silver tea service, a beautifully bound Bible, a clock that looked to be of fine craftsmanship. Margaret's grandmother sat in a rocking chair by the window, her sharp eyes tracking Ethan's every movement as he entered the room. She was a thin woman with white hair pulled back severely from her face, her posture still straight despite her advanced years. Grandmother, this is Mr. Ethan Fairfield, Margaret introduced. Mr. Fairfield, my grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Voss. Ethan nodded respectfully. Madam, so you're the cowboy who proposed to my granddaughter in the middle of her ruined wedding, Eleanor said without preamble. Grandmother. Margaret protested. It's all right, Ethan assured her. Yes, madam, that's me. Bold move, Eleanor commented, or foolish, depending on how one looks at it. I've been called worse than foolish, Mrs. Voss. A hint of amusement flickered across the old woman's face. Sit down, young man. Let me look at you properly. Ethan sat in the offered chair while Thomas climbed onto his grandmother's lap with the wooden horse, making it gallop along her arm. Margaret tells me you work at the Lazy S, Eleanor continued. For now, Ethan confirmed. I've been there about a week. And before that, the Bar X in Wyoming for a season. Before that, the Triple D in Montana. A drifter, Eleanor said, just as she had in the church. I prefer to think of it as having diverse experience, Ethan replied evenly. Margaret returned from putting the wildflowers in water. Dinner is almost ready. Thomas, please go wash your hands. The boy slid from his grandmother's lap. Can the cowboy come with me? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. If he'd like to. Ethan followed Thomas to a small washroom off the kitchen, helping the boy reach the soap and making sure he didn't splash water everywhere. Do you really have a gun? Thomas asked as Ethan helped him dry his hands. I do, but it stays in my saddlebag most of the time. Have you ever shot a bad guy? Ethan considered the question. I've fired warning shots to scare off rustlers a time or two, but I've never had to shoot a person, and I hope I never do. Gregory had a gun, Thomas said matter-of-factly. He showed it to me once when Mama wasn't looking. He said all real men carry guns. Ethan crouched down to look the boy in the eye. Real men know when not to use them, Thomas. That's more important than carrying one. Thomas nodded solemnly. I like you better than Gregory. He never wanted to play with me. Well, I'd be happy to play with you anytime, Ethan promised, feeling a swell of protectiveness toward this earnest child. Dinner was a simple but well-prepared affair of roast chicken, potatoes, and early autumn vegetables from Margaret's garden. The conversation flowed more easily than Ethan had expected, with Margaret revealing a dry wit he hadn't glimpsed before, and Thomas chattering enthusiastically about everything from his wooden toys to the stray cat that sometimes visited their back porch. Eleanor watched Ethan carefully throughout the meal, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. When the dishes were cleared and Thomas had been allowed to go outside to see Domino under Margaret's supervision, the old woman finally spoke directly to him again. What are your intentions toward my granddaughter, Mr. Fairfield? And don't give me that nonsense about doing what's right. Men always have reasons beyond nobility. Ethan considered his answer carefully. Your granddaughter is a remarkable woman, Mrs. Voss, stronger than she knows. As for my intentions, I meant what I said about providing for her and the boy. Beyond that, I suppose we'd have to see where life takes us. You're not in love with her. No, madam, I'm not. We barely know each other, but I respect her. That seems like a decent foundation to build on. Eleanor's lips twitched. More decent than most marriages start with, I'll grant you that. She leaned forward. Margaret has had a difficult time of it. Her father doted on her, but he died when she was 17. Then that charming scoundrel James Elliot came through town, turned her head, left her with child, and disappeared before she even knew she was expecting. The boy's father, Eleanor nodded. She was young and naive. Her reputation has never recovered in this town, though God knows she's tried to make amends. This wedding to Gregory was supposed to restore her standing, give Thomas legitimacy. She sighed. I never trusted Gregory, but he had position in the community, a good business. I thought perhaps he truly cared for her. Some men can't raise another man's child, Ethan said neutrally. And you can, Eleanor challenged. I believe so. A boy needs guidance, someone to teach him to be a good man. It doesn't matter whose blood runs in his veins. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. You're either the most honorable man I've met in years or the most accomplished liar. Ethan smiled slightly. I'll take that as a compliment, madam. It wasn't entirely meant as one, she retorted, but her eyes had softened. From outside came the sound of Thomas's delighted laughter. Ethan and Alina moved to the window to see Margaret holding the boy up to stroke Domino's nose, the horse standing patiently as small fingers explored his face. "She hasn't laughed like that in months," Alina observed quietly. "Not since she accepted Gregory's proposal and convinced herself it was the right thing to do." Ethan watched as Margaret set Thomas down, then stroked Domino's neck herself, saying something to the boy that made him giggle again. Her hair had come slightly loose from its pins, and the afternoon sun caught the auburn highlights, making it glow like burnished copper. "She's been so focused on doing what's proper, what's expected," Alina continued. "Sometimes I think she's forgotten how to simply live." "Life has a way of doing that to people," Ethan replied. Alina turned to face him fully. "If you hurt her, if you make promises you don't intend to keep, you'll answer to me, Mr. Fairfield. I may be old, but I still know how to use my late husband's shotgun." "Yes, madam," Ethan said solemnly. "I believe you do." After dinner, Margaret walked Ethan to his horse while Thomas stayed inside with his grandmother, reluctantly agreeing to save his next ride for another day. "He's quite taken with you," Margaret observed as they reached Domino, "and with your horse." "He's a fine boy," Ethan replied. "You've done well with him." "I've done my best," she sighed, "but a boy needs a father figure." "Gregory wasn't right for that role," Ethan said carefully. "No," Margaret agreed. "I see that now. I was so desperate to give Thomas legitimacy to stop the whispers that I ignored the signs." She looked up at Ethan. "I won't make that mistake again." "I don't expect you to trust me right away," Ethan said. "Trust is earned." Margaret was quiet for a moment, absently stroking Domino's neck. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she finally said. "And I have a counter-offer. I'm listening. The ranch needs a foreman. Someone who understands cattle, can manage the few hands we hire seasonally, can help build it into something more substantial." "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a position," Margaret corrected. "Room and board in the small cabin by the barn. A chance for us to get to know each other without the pressure of marriage. If after some time we feel a more permanent arrangement would be beneficial, we could discuss it then." Ethan considered this. "That's a sensible suggestion." "You seem disappointed," Margaret observed. "Not at all," Ethan assured her. "It's the right approach. I just need to give notice at the Lazy S." "You'll accept then?" "Yes, madam, I will. When would you like me to start?" "Is Wednesday too soon?" "That would give you time to settle your affairs at the ranch." Ethan nodded. "Wednesday it is." Margaret hesitated, then extended her hand formally. "Thank you, Mr. Fairfield." Ethan took her hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work despite her ladylike appearance. "Ethan, please, if we're going to be working together." "Ethan," she repeated, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Then you must call me Margaret." "Margaret," he said, and something in the way her name sounded in his voice made her cheeks flush slightly. She withdrew her hand. "Until Wednesday, then." "Until Wednesday." As Ethan rode away, he found himself looking forward to Wednesday with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a marriage proposal, but it was a beginning. And for a man who had never allowed himself to imagine a settled future, it felt remarkably like hope. Wednesday arrived with a storm front, dark clouds gathering on the horizon as Ethan packed his few belongings into his saddlebags. The men at the Lazy S had given him a good-natured send-off, ribbing him about settling down, but seeming genuinely pleased for him. The foreman had told him he'd always have a job there if things didn't work out, a kindness Ethan appreciated but hoped he wouldn't need. Margaret's ranch was smaller than the Lazy S but well situated, with a creek running through the eastern section and good grazing land. The main house was a sturdy two-story structure, modest but well built, with a wrap-around porch and smoke curling from the chimney. A large barn stood nearby, along with a smaller cabin that Ethan assumed would be his new home. As he rode up, Thomas came bursting out of the house, nearly tripping in his excitement. "Ethan, you came." "I said I would, didn't I?" Ethan dismounted, grinning as the boy hugged his leg. Margaret appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Welcome, Ethan. I see you've already been greeted by our most enthusiastic resident. Best welcome I've had in years, Ethan replied, ruffling Thomas's hair. Can I show him his cabin, Mama, please? Thomas begged. Margaret nodded. Go ahead, I'll have lunch ready in about an hour. Thomas grabbed Ethan's free hand, pulling him toward the small cabin while Ethan led Domino with his other hand. We cleaned it real good, the boy chattered. Grandmother said it was a disgrace, but Mama said it just needed some care. There were spiders, but I helped get them out. Not by killing them. Mama says we shouldn't kill spiders because they eat the bad bugs. We just moved them outside. That was kind of you, Ethan smiled, allowing himself to be led. The cabin was indeed clean, with fresh bedding on the narrow cot, a small table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove for heating, and hooks on the wall for clothing. Someone had placed a vase of late wildflowers on the table and laid a fire in the stove, ready to be lit. Do you like it? Thomas asked anxiously. It's perfect, Ethan assured him. Best place I've had in a long time. After settling Domino in the barn with the other horses, a sturdy mare and 2 workhorses, Ethan spent the rest of the morning being shown around the property by an excitable Thomas. The boy knew every inch of the ranch and spoke with proprietary pride about the cattle, the creek where he sometimes caught small fish, and the old oak tree where his mother had built him a small platform to serve as a fort. By the time they returned to the main house for lunch, Ethan had a good sense of the property and a growing admiration for how well Margaret had maintained it on her own. Your mother has done a fine job with this ranch, Ethan commented as they approached the house. She works real hard, Thomas agreed solemnly. Sometimes she falls asleep at the table because she's so tired. Ethan felt a twinge of concern. Well, that's what I'm here for now, to help with the hard work so she doesn't have to do it all. Thomas looked up at him with those serious blue eyes. Are you going to be my new papa? The directness of the question caught Ethan off guard. I don't know, Thomas. Would you like that? The boy considered this carefully. I think so. You're nicer than Gregory, and you talk to me like I'm big, not like I'm a baby. Well, you are pretty big for your age, Ethan observed. That's what I tell Mama, but she still makes me take naps sometimes. Ethan chuckled. Naps are important even for big fellows. Lunch was a simple affair of ham sandwiches and apple slices, with Alina notably absent. When Ethan inquired after her, Margaret explained that her grandmother had returned to her own small house in town that morning. She prefers her independence, Margaret said. She stayed with us during the engagement, but she has her own home near the church. After lunch, Thomas was indeed sent for a nap despite his protests, and Margaret suggested she and Ethan discuss the specifics of his position over coffee. The ranch isn't large, she explained as they sat at the kitchen table. 40 head of cattle, the horses you've seen, a small vegetable garden, and some chickens. My father ran it more as a hobby than a business. His real work was as the town doctor. After he died, I managed as best I could with occasional hired help. You've done remarkably well, Ethan said sincerely. Margaret looked surprised at the compliment. Thank you, but I know it could be more profitable with the right management. The land to the north could support more cattle if the fencing were extended. The creek provides good water, and there's a market for beef with the mining operations in the mountains. You've thought this through, Ethan observed. I've had plenty of time to think, she replied with a hint of dryness. What I haven't had is the physical strength or the knowledge to implement those thoughts. That's where you come in. They spent the next hour discussing the ranch operations, with Margaret revealing a sharp business mind that further impressed Ethan. By the time Thomas woke from his nap, they had outlined a plan for the coming months, repairs to be made before winter set in, preparations for spring expansion, a modest increase to the herd if finances allowed. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as evening approached, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. Margaret insisted Ethan join them for dinner rather than return to his cabin in the downpour, and he found himself sitting at their table for the second time that week, watching as Thomas regaled them with stories of his adventures with the barn cats. It felt, Ethan realized with a start, like family. The thought was both comforting and terrifying for a man who had avoided attachment for most of his adult life, After dinner, as Margaret prepared to put Thomas to bed, the boy asked if Ethan would read him a story. Margaret glanced at Ethan uncertainly. "If it's all right with your mother," Ethan said, looking to Margaret for permission. She nodded after a brief hesitation. "One story, Thomas. It's already past your bedtime." Upstairs in Thomas's small bedroom, Ethan settled into a chair beside the bed while the boy snuggled under his quilt, clutching the wooden horse Ethan had given him. "This one, please," Thomas said, pushing a worn copy of Jack and the Beanstalk toward Ethan. As Ethan read, occasionally glancing up to see Thomas's rapt expression, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a sense of belonging, of purpose beyond the next day's work or the next town's opportunities. By the time he finished the story, Thomas's eyes were drooping, though he fought valiantly against sleep. "Will you be here tomorrow?" the boy asked drowsily. "I will," Ethan promised, "and the day after that." "Good," Thomas murmured, finally allowing his eyes to close. "Night, Ethan." "Good night, Thomas," Ethan whispered, resisting the unexpected urge to kiss the boy's forehead before quietly leaving the room. Margaret was waiting in the hallway, her face unreadable. "He's never taken to anyone so quickly," she said softly. "He's a good kid," Ethan replied. "Smart, too." "Yes, he is," Margaret hesitated. "Ethan, I should warn you, Thomas has been disappointed before. Gregory made promises to him that were never kept. If you don't intend to stay, please don't encourage his attachment." The concern in her voice touched Ethan deeply. "Margaret, I meant what I said to him. I'll be here tomorrow and the day after that. I don't make promises lightly, especially not to children." She studied his face, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with what she saw there. "The rain has stopped. I won't keep you any longer." As Ethan walked back to his cabin under a clearing sky, he found himself thinking of the small family in the house behind him, a brave woman and her open-hearted son, both of whom had been wounded by men who should have protected them. He made a silent vow to be different, to be worthy of the trust they were cautiously placing in him. For the first time in years, the path ahead seemed clear, and Ethan Fairfield, lifelong drifter, felt no urge to run. The weeks passed quickly as autumn deepened toward winter. Ethan threw himself into the work of the ranch, repairing neglected fences, preparing the barn for the coming cold, and familiarizing himself with every aspect of the operation. Margaret worked alongside him when Thomas was occupied or napping, proving herself knowledgeable and hardworking despite her ladylike appearance. They fell into an easy routine, sharing meals in the main house, discussing ranch business, and gradually learning each other's histories. Ethan told Margaret about his childhood in Missouri, his mother who had worked herself to the bone to provide for him after his father left, his early years working cattle drives and breaking horses across the territories. Margaret shared stories of her father, the respected town doctor who had raised her alone after her mother died in childbirth, and of her naive romance with James Elliott, the smooth-talking gambler who had left her heartbroken and pregnant at 19. "I was such a fool," she admitted one evening as they sat on the porch after Thomas had gone to bed, the autumn chill requiring blankets wrapped around their shoulders. "James told me everything I wanted to hear. He promised to take me to San Francisco to show me the world beyond this small town." "You were young," Ethan said gently. "We all make mistakes when we're young." "My mistake walks around on two legs and calls me Mama," Margaret replied, but her voice held no regret, only a fierce love. "I wouldn't change having Thomas for anything, but I wish his beginning had been different, that he had a father who wanted him from the start." "He has that now," Ethan said without thinking. Margaret turned to look at him, her expression softening in the lantern light. "Yes," she said quietly, "I believe he does." Their relationship had remained strictly professional, with both carefully maintaining appropriate boundaries despite the domestic nature of their arrangement. But moments like this, quiet conversations under starry skies, were becoming more frequent, and Ethan found himself looking forward to them more than he cared to admit. Thomas had fully embraced Ethan's presence, trailing after him during chores, peppering him with questions about horses and cattle, and insisting on helping with even the most mundane tasks. Ethan discovered he had a natural patience with the boy, explaining processes that most men would have considered too complex for a 3-year-old, and treating Thomas's questions with the seriousness they deserved. "You're good with him," Margaret observed one Saturday as she watched Ethan teaching Thomas how to groom Domino properly. "Better than I expected," Ethan shrugged. "He makes it easy, smart kid eager to learn. Not all men would take the time," Margaret said. "Gregory certainly didn't." "Gregory was a fool in more ways than one," Ethan replied, then immediately regretted his bluntness. "I'm sorry, that was out of line." To his surprise, Margaret laughed a genuine, unrestrained sound that made something flutter in his chest. It was, she agreed, but it was also true. As winter settled over Silverton, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a white wonderland, their small household grew closer. Elinor visited for Sunday dinners, gradually warming to Ethan as she observed his steadfast presence and his genuine affection for Thomas. The townsfolk, initially suspicious of the arrangement, began to accept Ethan's presence as rumors of his hard work and respectful behavior toward the Calloway widow, as they incorrectly but persistently called Margaret, circulated. Christmas approached, and with it came a sense of anticipation that Ethan hadn't felt since childhood. He spent his evenings carefully crafting gifts in his cabin, a proper wooden fort for Thomas to replace the platform in the oak tree, a set of carved animals to populate it, and for Margaret, a delicate music box with a dancing figure that had cost him most of his saved wages from the Lazy S. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside, the three of them gathered in the main house. Margaret had decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and a small tree stood in the corner of the parlor, adorned with paper ornaments that Thomas had made with Elinor's help. The boy was nearly vibrating with excitement, having been promised he could open one gift before bed. "This one, Mama, please," Thomas begged, pointing to a large package that Ethan had brought in earlier. Margaret nodded, smiling. "Go ahead, darling." Thomas tore into the paper with abandon, gasping when he uncovered the wooden fort. "It's like mine in the tree, but better, so you can play inside during the winter," Ethan explained, helping the boy set it up on the floor. "See, the roof comes off so you can arrange the inside however you want." Thomas threw his arms around Ethan's neck. "Thank you, it's the best present ever." "You're welcome, partner," Ethan replied, his throat suddenly tight with emotion. Later, after Thomas had reluctantly gone to bed with promises that Santa would only come when he was asleep, Ethan and Margaret sat before the fire, enjoying the quiet moment. "That was a wonderful gift," Margaret said softly. "You must have spent hours on it." "It was worth it to see his face," Ethan replied. "I have something for you too, but I thought perhaps we should wait for morning." Margaret shook her head, reaching beside her chair to retrieve a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Actually, I was hoping we might exchange our gifts now while it's just the two of us." Ethan nodded, retrieving the small box containing the music box from his coat pocket. They exchanged packages with shy smiles, like children rather than adults. "You first," Margaret insisted. Ethan carefully unwrapped the package to find a beautiful leather-bound journal and a quality fountain pen. "Margaret, this is too fine for me." "Nonsense," she replied firmly. "I've seen you writing notes about the ranch, keeping track of everything in that tattered notebook. You deserve something better." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched him deeply. Few people in his life had ever paid such careful attention to his needs or habits. "Thank you," he said simply, unable to express the fullness of his gratitude. "Now yours," he said, handing her the small box. Margaret unwrapped it carefully, her eyes widening as she opened the box to reveal the music box. She lifted it out with gentle hands, turning the key to set the mechanism in motion. A delicate melody filled the room as the tiny figure began to spin. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes, "it's beautiful." "I noticed you humming that tune sometimes when you're working," he explained. "The shopkeeper in town said it's from an opera lacmé, I think he called it." "My father took me to see it once in Denver for my 16th birthday," Margaret said, watching the spinning figure with wonder in her eyes. "It's one of my most precious memories." I'm glad I chose the right one then. Margaret set the music box carefully on the table beside her, then turned to face Ethan fully. You notice things about people, she said quietly. Things most wouldn't bother to see. Only about people who matter, Ethan replied, then immediately felt his face warm at the admission. Margaret's gaze dropped to her hands for a moment, then lifted to meet his again. Ethan, these past weeks, they've meant more to me than I can say. Having you here, seeing how you are with Thomas, how you've brought life back to this ranch, Margaret, Ethan interrupted gently, I should be thanking you. You gave me a chance when you had every reason to be suspicious. You opened your home to me, you and Thomas. He hesitated, then forged ahead. You've become family to me. The word hung between them, charged with meaning. Margaret's eyes softened, and in a gesture that surprised them both, she reached out to take his hand. I've been thinking about your proposal, she said softly. The one you made in the church that day. Ethan's heart began to race. Have you? Yes, she took a deep breath. If it still stands, I think I'd like to accept it. Ethan stared at her, momentarily speechless. Are you certain? There's no rush, Margaret. We can continue as we are for as long as you need. I'm certain, she replied firmly. Thomas needs a father, a real father who loves him, not someone who merely tolerates him for my sake. And she paused, color rising in her cheeks. I find that I no longer wish for merely a practical arrangement. Ethan felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. What are you saying, Margaret? I'm saying that I care for you, Ethan Fairfield, more than I ever expected to care for anyone again. And if you still wish to marry me, to be a father to Thomas, then my answer is yes. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the hope and vulnerability in her eyes. In that moment, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that the drifting part of his life was over. I want nothing more, he said, raising her hand to his lips. Margaret's smile was radiant. Then we have one more gift to open tomorrow morning, telling Thomas. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the snow-covered landscape glittering in the sunlight. Thomas woke them all at dawn, bursting into Margaret's room with excitement about Santa's visit, then rushing to Ethan's cabin to drag him to the house as well. The morning was filled with laughter and delight as Thomas opened his gifts, the carved animals from Ethan, new winter clothes and books from Margaret, and a wooden train set that had been his grandfather's, carefully preserved by Alina for this Christmas. Ethan and Margaret exchanged glances throughout the morning, both nervous and excited about the conversation to come. Finally, when the flurry of gift opening had subsided and Thomas sat contentedly playing with his new toys, Margaret called him to join them on the sofa. Thomas, Ethan and I have something important to talk to you about, she began, taking her son's small hand in hers. The boy looked between them curiously. Is it a secret? Not anymore, Ethan smiled. Thomas, I've asked your mother if I could become part of your family officially, if I could be your father and her husband. Would that be all right with you? Thomas's eyes grew wide. Really, forever and ever, Ethan confirmed solemnly. Thomas launched himself into Ethan's arms with such force that it nearly knocked him backward. Yes, I want you to be my papa. Over the boy's head, Ethan met Margaret's gaze, seeing the tears of joy glistening in her eyes. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the home they had built together, Ethan knew he had found what he had been searching for his entire life without even realizing it. Well then, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I guess it's settled. They were married on New Year's Day of 1880 in a small ceremony at Margaret's house, rather than the church where she had been humiliated months before. Alina, resplendent in her best dress, stood proudly beside her granddaughter. Thomas, serious about his role as ring-bearer, carried the simple gold bands on a small cushion Alina had embroidered for the occasion. The guest list was small, a few friendly neighbors, the foreman from the Lazy S and his wife, and the kind pastor who had agreed to perform the ceremony in their home despite some raised eyebrows from his congregation. Notably absent was Gregory Townsend, who had taken to avoiding Margaret entirely since the incident at the church. As Margaret walked toward him in a simple blue dress, her hair adorned with winter blossoms, Ethan felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was no practical arrangement anymore. Somewhere in the months of working together, sharing meals and raising Thomas, they had built something real and precious. When they spoke their vows, Ethan added a special promise to Thomas, kneeling to the boy's level and speaking directly to him. "I promise to be the father you deserve, to guide you, protect you, and love you as my own son for all the days of my life." Thomas, overwhelmed by the solemnity of the moment, simply threw his arms around Ethan's neck and held on tight. The small reception afterward was warm and joyful, with Alina surprising everyone by producing a fiddle player who set up in the corner of the parlor, filling the house with lively music. As afternoon turned to evening, Thomas fell asleep on Alina's lap, exhausted from the excitement and the late hour. "I'll put him to bed," Margaret whispered, gathering her sleeping son in her arms. "I'll help," Ethan offered, following her up the stairs to Thomas's room. Together they tucked the boy into bed, each placing a kiss on his forehead before quietly leaving the room. In the hallway, Ethan took Margaret's hand, drawing her close. "Mrs. Fairfield," he said softly, testing the name. Margaret smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Ethan replied, finally giving in to the urge he'd been fighting for months and lowering his lips to hers. The kiss was tender at first, then deepening with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless. "I should warn you," Margaret whispered, her cheeks flushed. "This may no longer be quite the arrangement we initially discussed." Ethan chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm counting on it, Mrs. Fairfield." The guests had departed by the time they returned downstairs, with only Alina remaining, dozing in a chair by the fire. She roused herself as they entered, taking in their clasped hands and flushed faces with a knowing smile. "Well," she said, rising stiffly to her feet, "I believe my work here is done. I'll see myself back to town." "Grandmother, you can't walk all that way in the dark," Margaret protested. "Who said anything about walking? I've arranged for Jacob Miller to collect me with his sleigh." As if on cue, the sound of sleigh bells came from outside. "He's right on time." Alina gathered her shawl around her shoulders, then surprised Ethan by reaching up to pat his cheek. "You're a good man, Ethan Fairfield, better than I initially gave you credit for. Take care of them." "With my life," Ethan promised. After seeing Alina off, they returned to the warmth of their home, truly theirs now in every sense. The house was quiet, the remnants of the celebration still visible in the half-empty glasses and plates of cake. "We should probably clean up," Margaret said, though she made no move toward the dishes. "Probably," Ethan agreed, drawing her into his arms instead. "Tomorrow," Margaret laughed softly. "Tomorrow," she agreed, rising on her toes to kiss him again. As the snow began to fall outside, blanketing the ranch in a fresh layer of white, Ethan Fairfield held his wife in his arms and silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him to that church on that autumn day. The drifter had found his home, the abandoned bride had found her true partner, and somewhere upstairs, a little boy was dreaming of adventures with his new father. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers and fresh green grass, transforming the Fairfield ranch from its winter slumber into a hive of activity. Ethan had implemented many of the improvements they had discussed in those early days, expanding the fencing to the north pastures, increasing their herd with quality stock purchased at favorable prices, and adding a small but profitable horse breeding operation centered around Domino, whose lineage proved more impressive than Ethan had initially realized. Margaret had blossomed in her own way, her natural business acumen finding expression in the ranch's improved bookkeeping and strategic planning. Together, they made a formidable team, each complementing the other's strengths. Thomas, now 4 years old and growing like a weed, thrived under Ethan's guidance. The boy had taken to ranch life with enthusiasm, proudly helping with age-appropriate chores and soaking up Ethan's lessons on horses, cattle, and the land with an eagerness that made both parents proud. Their marriage had deepened beyond either's expectations, the initial respect and friendship transforming into a love that surprised them both with its intensity. Ethan, who had never imagined himself as a husband or father, found that these roles suited him better than any he had played before. One particularly fine April morning, as they sat at breakfast planning the day ahead, Margaret set down her coffee cup with a strange expression on her face. "Everything all right?" Ethan asked, immediately concerned. "More than all right," she replied, a smile spreading across her face. "Ethan, I believe we're going to have an addition to our family come winter." Ethan stared at her, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "You mean?" Margaret nodded, her eyes shining. "I'm fairly certain all the signs are there." "A baby," Ethan breathed, a mix of wonder and terror washing over him. "We're having a baby." "What baby?" Thomas piped up, looking between his parents with curiosity. Margaret and Ethan exchanged glances, having not anticipated sharing the news quite so soon. "Well, Thomas," Margaret began carefully, "it seems that you might be getting a little brother or sister in a few months." Thomas's eyes widened. "Really? Where is it?" "Right now, it's growing in my tummy," Margaret explained, placing a hand over her still flat abdomen. "It's very tiny now, but it will grow bigger as the months pass." Thomas considered this information with the seriousness he applied to all new concepts. "Will I have to share my room?" Ethan chuckled. "Not right away, partner. Babies start out pretty small. But yes, eventually you might need to be a big brother and share your space." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I can do that. I'm good at sharing. Grandmother says so." "Yes, you are," Margaret agreed, reaching out to smooth his hair. "You're going to be the best big brother." After Thomas had been excused to play before his morning lessons with Margaret, Ethan moved to his wife's side, kneeling beside her chair to place a gentle hand over hers on her stomach. "Are you happy?" Margaret asked softly, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Ethan replied, looking up at her with such tenderness that her eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd have this, Margaret, a family, a home, a child of my own blood. Thomas is my son in every way that matters, but this." He trailed off, overwhelmed by emotion. "I know," she whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "I feel the same way." They stayed that way for a long moment, connected in their shared joy and anticipation, until the sound of Thomas calling from outside broke the spell. "Papa." "Come quick, the new calf is trying to stand up." Ethan pressed a quick kiss to Margaret's lips before rising. "Duty calls," he smiled. "Go," she laughed, shooing him toward the door. "Fatherhood waits for no man." As Ethan hurried outside to where Thomas was watching the wobbly newborn calf with fascination, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in less than a year. From a drifting cowboy with no ties to a husband, father, and rancher with deep roots in this land and these people. All because he had been in that church on that fateful day, all because he had spoken those impulsive words. "I'll be the father he never wanted to be." Words that had changed everything, words that had given him the family he never knew he wanted, words that had led him home. As summer turned to fall and fall eased into winter, Margaret's pregnancy progressed with a healthy glow that transformed her already beautiful features into something radiant. Ethan found himself watching her with wonder as she moved through her days, one hand often resting protectively over her growing belly as she taught Thomas his letters, prepared meals, or reviewed the ranch accounts. Thomas had embraced the idea of becoming a big brother with enthusiasm, talking to the baby through Margaret's stomach, and helping Ethan prepare a small nursery in what had been a storage room adjacent to the master bedroom. Together they had painted the walls a soft yellow, assembled a crib that Ethan had commissioned from the town's carpenter, and hung colorful quilts that Alina had begun stitching the moment she heard the news. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management, with the fall roundup yielding a handsome profit and Domino's first foals showing excellent conformation that promised good prices when they were ready for sale. They had hired 2 permanent hands to help with the increased workload, building a second bunkhouse to accommodate them during the busy seasons. As Christmas approached once again, the anniversary of their engagement, a heavy snowstorm descended on Silverton, keeping them housebound for several days. Thomas delighted in the forced confinement, building elaborate structures with his blocks and wooden figures while Ethan read to him from his growing collection of books. Margaret, now in her 8th month and moving more slowly, used the time to finish knitting tiny garments for the baby. On the evening of the 3rd day of snowfall, as they sat together in the warm parlor, Thomas looked up from his play to ask, "Papa, where did you come from?" "Before you were here," Ethan, who had been whittling a new figurine for Thomas's collection, paused in his work. "Well, I was born in Missouri, but I traveled all over the territories before I came to Silverton." "But why did you come here?" Thomas persisted. "Was it to find us?" Ethan glanced at Margaret, who was watching the exchange with interest, her hands resting on her rounded stomach. "I didn't know I was looking for you," he said honestly. "But sometimes life leads us to exactly where we need to be, even when we don't realize it. Like when you came to Mama's wedding," Thomas asked innocently. Margaret tensed slightly, the memory of that humiliating day still tender despite the happiness that had ultimately resulted from it. "Yes," Ethan said carefully. "I came to town for work, but I ended up finding something much more important. Us," Thomas said with satisfaction. "You," Ethan confirmed, setting aside his carving to lift Thomas onto his lap. "The best thing that ever happened to me." Thomas beamed, then turned serious again. "Gregory was mean to Mama. He made her cry." Ethan and Margaret exchanged surprised glances. They had rarely discussed Gregory in Thomas's presence, assuming he had been too young to remember much about the man or the events of that day. "Yes, he was unkind," Ethan acknowledged, seeing no reason to lie to the boy. "But sometimes, Thomas, even bad things can lead to good ones." "If Gregory hadn't been mean, I might never have met you and your mother." Thomas considered this, then nodded. "I'm glad you're my papa instead of him." "So am I, partner," Ethan said, his throat tight with emotion. "So am I." Later that night, after Thomas was asleep and they were preparing for bed, Margaret brought up the conversation again. "He remembers more than I realized," she said quietly, sitting at her dressing table as she brushed her hair. "About Gregory, about that day." Ethan moved behind her, taking the brush from her hand to continue the strokes himself. "Children absorb more than we give them credit for." "I worry sometimes," Margaret admitted, closing her eyes at the soothing sensation of the brush moving through her hair. "That he'll be hurt by knowing his birth father didn't want him, that Gregory rejected him as well." "Thomas knows he's loved," Ethan said firmly. "That's what matters. And when he's older, if he has questions about James Elliott, we'll answer them honestly but with kindness." Margaret reached up to catch his hand, bringing it to her cheek. "How did I get so fortunate, Ethan Fairfield, to find a man like you after everything?" Ethan leaned down to press a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm the fortunate one, Margaret, never doubt that." As if in agreement, the baby chose that moment to deliver a strong kick that was visible even through Margaret's nightgown. They both laughed, Ethan placing his hand on the spot to feel the movements of their child. "Active tonight," he observed. "She's been restless all day," Margaret replied. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You sound certain." Margaret smiled mysteriously. "Just a feeling. Mother's intuition, perhaps." "Well, son or daughter, this little one will be here soon enough," Ethan said, helping Margaret to her feet and leading her to their bed. "And our family will be complete." Margaret settled into bed with a contented sigh, then gave him a thoughtful look. "Complete for now, perhaps, but I wouldn't mind giving Thomas more than one sibling if you're agreeable." Ethan's heart swelled with love for this woman who had given him everything he never knew he wanted. "I'm agreeable to whatever makes you happy, Mrs. Fairfield. You make me happy," she replied simply. "You and our children." The baby arrived 2 weeks later, in the middle of a clear, cold January night. Ethan had ridden through the snow to fetch both the town doctor and a leaner, his heart pounding with fear and excitement as Margaret's labor progressed. Thomas had been sent to stay with a neighbor for the duration, though he had protested mightily at being excluded from the momentous event. After 12 hours of labor, Margaret's pained cries gave way to the lusty wails of a newborn, and Dr. Patterson emerged from the bedroom with a tired smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Fairfield," he said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "You have a healthy son." A son. Ethan's knees nearly buckled with relief and joy, And Margaret, tired but well, your mother-in-law is seeing to her now. You can go in shortly. When Ethan was finally allowed into the bedroom, he found Margaret propped up against the pillows, her face pale but radiant with exhaustion and happiness. In her arms, wrapped in one of Aliner's lovingly crafted quilts, was a tiny bundle with a shock of dark hair. "Come meet your son," Margaret said softly as Ethan approached the bed with reverent steps. He sat carefully on the edge of the mattress, peering at the small, red face of his child. The baby's eyes were tightly shut, his miniature fingers curled into fists beside his cheeks. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, tentatively reaching out to touch the downy head. "Would you like to hold him?" Margaret asked. With trembling hands, Ethan accepted the precious bundle, cradling his son with the same care he might show a bird's egg. The baby squirmed slightly, then settled against his chest, seeming to recognize the safety of his father's arms. "Hello, little one," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been waiting to meet you." Aliner, who had been tidying the room, paused to watch the scene with misty eyes. "Have you decided on a name?" she asked. Margaret and Ethan exchanged glances. They had discussed various options but hadn't made a final decision. "I was thinking," Margaret said hesitantly, "perhaps William after my father and maybe James for a middle name." Ethan looked at her in surprise. Margaret nodded. "Despite everything, he gave me Thomas. I don't regret that, even if I regret the circumstances." Ethan considered this, looking down at the sleeping infant in his arms. "William James Fairfield," he tested the name. "It's a good, strong name." "A name with history," Aliner observed. "Both acknowledged and new." "Just like our family," Margaret said softly. Later that day, after Margaret had rested and Aliner had gone to fetch Thomas from the neighbors, Ethan sat in a chair by the bedroom window, still holding his son. The winter sunlight streamed through the glass, warming them both as Ethan marveled at the tiny features, the perfect fingers and toes, the soft rise and fall of the small chest. "You know," he said quietly to Margaret, who was watching them from the bed, "I spent most of my life running. Never staying in one place long enough to put down roots, never letting myself get attached to people or places." "What changed?" Margaret asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "I did," Ethan replied simply. "Or rather, you and Thomas changed me. Made me want things I never thought I would: a home, a family, a legacy to leave behind." "Any regrets?" Margaret asked, a hint of the old vulnerability in her voice. Ethan looked at her with all the love in his heart. "Only that it took me so long to find you." The sound of a sleigh arriving interrupted the moment, followed shortly by the thunder of small feet on the stairs and Thomas's excited voice calling for his parents. "In here, Thomas," Margaret called, sitting up straighter and adjusting her appearance. The door burst open and Thomas rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and cold. "Is the baby here? Can I see?" "Come meet your brother," Ethan said, shifting William slightly so Thomas could get a better view. Thomas approached cautiously, his eyes wide with wonder. "He's so small," he whispered. "You were this small once too," Margaret told him, patting the bed beside her. Thomas scrambled up to sit next to his mother, still staring in fascination at the baby. "His name is William," Ethan explained. "William James Fairfield. But we can call him Will for short." "Hello, Will," Thomas said softly, reaching out to touch the baby's hand with one finger. To everyone's delight, William's tiny fingers reflexively closed around his brother's. "Look, he's holding my hand. He knows who you are," Margaret smiled. "His big brother. I'm going to teach him everything," Thomas declared. "How to ride a horse and feed the chickens and build forts, and all in good time," Ethan chuckled. "He needs to learn to walk first." "I can teach him that too," Thomas said confidently. As Aliner joined them, the small room filled with the warm presence of family, not one created by blood alone, but by choice, by commitment, by love that had grown from the most unexpected beginnings. Looking around at his wife, his sons, and the formidable grandmother who had become his ally, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. From a drifting cowboy with no ties to the earth to a man surrounded by love, responsible for these precious lives, anchored firmly to this land and these people. All because he had spoken those words in a moment of impulse, driven by something he couldn't name but now recognized as destiny. "I'll be the father he never wanted to be." Words that had changed everything. Words that had brought him home. 5 years later, the Fairfield Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous operations in the county. The original 100 acres had been expanded to over 500, with lush pastures supporting a herd of over 200 cattle and a dozen breeding horses descended from Domino's line. The modest house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family, with a new wing added to the eastern side and a proper office for managing the ranch business. Thomas, now 9 years old, had developed into a confident, thoughtful boy who excelled at school and showed a natural affinity for working with the horses. William, 5 and full of mischief, shadowed his older brother everywhere, attempting to imitate his every move. And the newest addition to the family, 3-year-old Elizabeth Eleanor Fairfield, named for Margaret's grandmother who had passed peacefully in her sleep the previous year, ruled the household with her sunny disposition and determined spirit. Ethan, now in his 35th year, had settled fully into his roles as husband, father, and rancher. The restlessness that had driven him for so many years had been replaced by a deep contentment, a sense of purpose that grew stronger with each passing season. His reputation in the community had transformed from that drifter who married the Cowboy woman to Fairfield, the rancher with the best horses in the county and the finest family a man could ask for. Margaret had blossomed as well, her natural intelligence finding expression in both the management of their growing ranch and in the community, where she had become a respected voice on the school board and in the Ladies' Aid Society. At 32, she retained the beauty that had first caught Ethan's attention, now enhanced by the confidence of a woman who knew herself and her worth. On a warm June evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching the children play in the yard, Ethan reached over to take Margaret's hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Fairfield?" he asked, noting the contemplative expression on her face. Margaret smiled, turning to meet his gaze. "I was thinking about that day in the church. How differently things might have turned out if Gregory hadn't shown his true colors, if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't spoken up." "Divine intervention," Ethan suggested with a smile. "Perhaps," Margaret agreed, "or perhaps just a good man recognizing a situation where he could make a difference." "I wasn't thinking about being a good man," Ethan admitted. "I just knew I couldn't let you walk away without offering something better than what you'd been given." "And look what came of it," Margaret said softly, gesturing to their home, their land, their children playing in the last light of day. William was attempting to teach Elizabeth how to rope a fence post, the little girl's face scrunched in concentration as she swung the small lariat Ethan had made for her. Thomas sat nearby, offering patient guidance while sketching in the notebook he carried everywhere these days. "A miracle," Ethan agreed, squeezing Margaret's hand. "3 miracles, actually." 4, Margaret corrected, her free hand moving to rest on her stomach in a gesture Ethan recognized immediately. His eyes widened. Again, Margaret nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Doctor Patterson confirmed it yesterday, due in January, just like William was." Ethan let out a whoop that startled the children into looking up from their play. He pulled Margaret into his arms, kissing her soundly without concern for propriety or the giggling reaction of their offspring. "Papa's kissing Mama again," William announced with the disgust only a 5-year-old boy could muster for such displays. "They do that a lot," Thomas informed his siblings with the world-weary wisdom of his 9 years. "It's why we keep getting more babies." Margaret buried her face against Ethan's shoulder, her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. "Thomas has apparently been paying attention during those talks about the calving and foaling," she murmured. "Seems we'll need to have a more detailed conversation soon," Ethan replied, his own laughter rumbling in his chest. The children, having lost interest in their parents' odd behavior, returned to their play. Ethan held Margaret close, his hand covering hers over the place where their 4th child was growing. "Are you happy?" he asked, echoing the question she had asked him when she first told him about William. Incandescently, she replied without hesitation. You've given me everything I ever wanted, Ethan. Security, love, a family to be proud of. You kept every promise you made that day in the church. As did you, Ethan said softly, thinking of the shy, wounded woman she had been when they first met and the confident, loving partner she had become. We built this together, Margaret, this home, this family, this life. Yes, she agreed, settling against his side as they turned their attention back to their children. Together. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan Fairfield reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a drifting cowboy with no place to call home, to a man surrounded by love, responsible for these precious lives, anchored firmly to this land and these people. All because he had been in that church on that fateful day. All because he had spoken those impulsive words to a woman abandoned at the altar with her child. I'll be the father he never wanted to be. Words that had changed everything. Words that had given him the family he never knew he wanted. Words that had finally, after years of wandering, led him home.